Today we're talking about a very interesting conversation, a conversation really that is really a global conversation because you know Gandhi statues are all over the world and they are not just in the Ghana University. So it would be great to just start off by saying, thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Obadele, and I'm very happy to have you there, to have you here because our main focus as King Africa Online radio station is to build Africa and to tell real stories in the narrative of Africans. And it's really a great pleasure to have leaders like yourself on this platform. um for a very long time, Dr. Obadele, I viewed Mr. Mahatma Gandhi as a very peaceful man who has fought for equality and who has also fought for the liberation of Indians. I mean, I also remember that when I was in school, we used to learn about Mahatma Gandhi, and we also learned that he was on the side, he was there in the struggle with Nelson Mandela. So it's very confusing for me as a young adult now to also to find out that the statue of Mahatma Gandhi has been removed in Ghana University. Not just in Ghana University, but also even in South Africa, we have issues of the statue being vandalized. So can you just please give me a background of where this is coming from?
Yeah, so it really all started off. I can give you just a brief timeline. I won't go into too much detail just so we can keep the conversation flowing. But on 27th May of 2016 is when we got an announcement that the president of India, Pranab Mukherjee, was coming to campus, University of Ghana campus. They actually sent several reminders, no mention of a Gandhi statue whatsoever. However, what India has decided to do is use the face of Gandhi as their soft power. It's basically neo-colonialism dressed up as anti-imperialism, according to Ahead, one of the authors of the Stretcher Bear of Empire, which deals with the role of Gandhi during the Bambata Rebellion, right, the Zulu Wars, where he agitated to get firearms to shoot down the Zulus and military training for same to take their share in the defense of the colony, to quote him. So all of these things are, things a lot of people are not aware of until really you go into his collected works, and there are 100 PDFs freely available that everyone can read. And what that does is it gives you a real view of who Gandhi was. And we never use the term Mahatma because that is a term of respect. We call him by his name Mohandas, right? That's his actual name, alias Mahatma, but we don't deal with that. So anyway, they eventually unveiled the statue on the 13th of June without any consultation or prior notice to the University of Ghana community. Just short of a month after that, on July 4th, 2016, I just happened to be driving by the statue, and I was like, wow, people must have no idea who this guy is. So anyway, I sent well over 50 quotes of his, I would say a few of his most racist quotes. And then that ended up with definitely a shocked, university community. And there was a running email debate and discussion. Most people, just like you, they were like, I had no idea. How could he say this? Is it true? So that was the first thing. They wanted to just go and verify and say, well, you can go to the primary text and verify yourself. This is his own followers who collected everything that they could get their hands on that he ever wrote: personal letters, newspaper columns in English, in Hindi, in Gujarati, translated those, everything that he wrote, diaries, day books, everything that he ever put down. And this is the thing that Gandhi later on in his autobiography tried to lie a lot, blatantly lie, and say things like, yeah, my heart was with the Zulus. When you actually read what he was writing at the time, he was trying to get military training and firearms to shoot down the Zulus. And that's something I'm sure is very close to your heart, because that could have been, and most likely was, at least a relative, if not an ancestor, who was killed eventually by the British during that time. And Gandhi was agitating. Eventually, when they said that they're not going to let them go to the war front, he says, well, at least we can furnish them with tobacco, and other things, right, for the boys at the war front. So he was just adamant about this. But I'll continue. I think we'll go more in depth into his sordid life.
Yeah.
So eventually, September 12th, we initiated a petition, Gandhi Must Fall online petition at change.org. We eventually delivered that petition just a couple of weeks later on the 21st of September. And, you know, interestingly, a counter petition was started. And I've tried to find it online. What I can find is one on change.org by these same people with 12 signatures. So we got over 1,500 signatures in 2 weeks. These sellout house Negroes got 12 signatures, but, you know, we'll leave them to the side. Anyway, you know, and basically what you find is that there's a real reactionary populace. You know, not a whole lot of them by 12 signatures, we could say, but there are people who are just like, you know, I think he was great. I was told he was great, and it must be true, right? Regardless of any evidence that I get, you know, that's proven, that's actually showing what he's really about. I think he must be great. So, you know, that's it. So they're holding on to their illusionary fantasies. But, you know, that's another thing. Eventually, on the 30th of September, we got a letter from the University Council acknowledging receipt of the petition. On the 2nd of October, an auspicious date, the statue was defaced with the spectacles stolen. Just a couple of days later, myself and Professor Adamako Ampofo, we gave basically a seminar that situated the Gandhi Must Fall events in the context of Black Lives Matter and decolonizing the academy. The day after, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said they're going to take away the statue. And then council said that they would not be against that. And, you know, it eventually culminated in December, I want to say December 15th, if I recall correctly, of, that was what, 2018, that the statue was eventually taken down. And there's a photograph of myself standing on the plinth where that statue used to be. And it really represents knocking down Eurasian power and putting up, you know, African equals Black power. And the reason why I use the term Eurasian is that oftentimes we'll point the finger at, you know, so-called Europeans. One is that Europe is not a continent. I'm not sure if you're aware of this. Under no definition does this little sliver of Eurasia qualify as its own continent. So this is a figment of imagination that we're all taught in school, just like Gandhi. But when you look at a satellite map, you'll see this is not a continent any more than West Africa is a continent, any more than South Africa is a continent. So anyway, one is because that whole European thing is based on fraud that you can see with your own eyes if you have eyes to see. But then two is because all these Eurasians throughout space and time have been the enemies of Black people. From the very first recorded narrative military document is called the Autobiography of Imahuweni. And it talks about the ruler of Kemet, what they now like to call ancient Egypt. Yeah. The ruler of Kemet bringing together all the Black people to drive away these Eurasians. But then if you look at the Arabs, right, vis-a-vis Black people, they have been the enemies of Black people. The Western Eurasians, who we quote unquote call Europeans, have been the enemies of Black people. The Indo-Aryans, right, the enemies of Black people. So we could go throughout length and breadth of time. So it helps us to look at them all together, just as our, you know, ancient ancestors did. In Kemet, where we use the term Amu to identify all of these folks who come from that continent of Eurasia. So I think I'll pause. I could keep going, as I'm sure you can imagine. Yeah, but I'll pause there in case you happen.
You know, a lot of people would come up and say, you know, aren't we starting a war with this, you know, with removing these statues? Because it's not just the Gandhi statue that has been removed, but also, you know, there's a couple of statues that have been removed. The one with Cecil Rhodes as well, in relation to the fees must fall. So are we starting a war? Are we starting a conscious movement that is literally stopping the oppression of Black people entirely? Because it's not just the fight in the University of Ghana, but, you know, this seems like a global movement.
And this is a thing. Oh, go ahead.
No, you can continue, Dr. Obadele.
Yeah, just with that thought, this is the thing. We actually got invited, and we have a book chapter out with Roads Must Fall, right? This ended up being a chapter in various places in the world. So they actually invited us, you know, from Gandhi Must Fall, which was very hot and global, like at that time. Everybody was coming to us about what's this, because shockingly, like shocking to me, most people just had absolutely no idea about this from various sectors throughout the entire world, right? They saw the Gandhi movie and so forth and so on. And I had researched into this quite some time ago, like back in the 90s, and then also the plight of the Dalits and how Gandhi suppressed them. For those who are interested, they can read Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar's text on what Congress and Gandhi have done to the untouchables. So it wasn't just against the Black people of the continent that he was against. He was also against the indigenous Black people of India. So once he left South Africa, he turned his attention to now suppressing, oppressing, and disenfranchising the people of India. And if anyone looks at that movie, Gandhi, there's like this point where he has this fast unto the death. The point of that fast was to coerce the untouchables into giving up their rights for the double vote and mandatory seats. But that's another sidebar. So yeah, just in terms of the global nature of it, I think that a lot of people were very taken by the Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall movement, and it was very strong, right? And I think we still see this to some degree. Recently discussions again about Rhodes University, and I saw that they voted, the council voted to keep the name, but I'm seeing this coming up again more recently. But I think one thing about Gandhi Must Fall is that because the Indian government has decided to make this the face of their imperialism, their soft power imperialism, and their proxy war with China over who's going to control Africa, because everyone knows, apparently except many Africans, that whosoever controls Africa controls the world. And unfortunately, it's not African people who control Africa. So China is getting in with their soft power through Confucius Institutes and through dollar imperialism or yuan imperialism of, okay, we're going to build your infrastructure, we're going to build this train, here, we're going to build these roads here, so forth and so on. And India really doesn't have that much, let's say, comparable weight to throw around in Africa. So they're much more pointed in what they do. One is through the face of their new imperialism, the face of Gandhi, but then also, recently they gave $1 million to the current president of Ghana to refurbish his, house, basically, Jubilee House, right? Surprise, surprise. And it was in the wake of this whole Gandhi Must Fall thing. And then they offered to also build a new parliament for $200 million. So, they're like, all right, well, we can't do what China's doing and just, build all your roads, but we're going to buy your president and we're going to buy your lawmakers. How's that? Right. Mm-hmm. And then, send these images of Gandhi all around. So I think this is one thing that is going to continue to make Gandhi Must Fall global. I think in ways that Rhodes Must Fall is not going to be global, because Rhodes isn't everywhere, right? It's not ubiquitous. You have the Rhodes Scholarship, and one of my colleagues, Kwao Imana, Dr. Kwao Imana, he gave a speech when he was valedictorian at Morehouse. And it was actually when I was here in Ghana doing study abroad, where he was offered a Rhodes Scholarship and he denounced, pronounced. His entire valedictorian speech was how essentially a so-called Jew should be quicker to take a Hitler scholarship than any Black person, self-respecting Black person should be to take a Rhodes Scholarship or attend Rhodes University or any of these things. Mm-hmm. So I think that was very powerful. So apart from just like things like the Rhodes Scholarship, Rhodes isn't as ubiquitous. Meanwhile, you have Gandhi statues being plopped down everywhere, right? Everywhere they can reach their tentacles. And this is a decision by India. But Malawi also had a Gandhi Must Fall movement, and they said they were inspired by the Ghana one. You're seeing this everywhere, that they're trying to do Mahatma Gandhi convention centers, quote unquote. Again, I don't like that term, Mahatma, because it doesn't fit. And put these statues everywhere. So I think this is going to be an ongoing debate for the dignity and self-respect of Black people into the years to come, because people are not willing to let this go. Once they've been woken up, they're not willing to go back to sleep. People can't unlearn what they know.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you. I'm actually happy that you mentioned the involvement of the government, because, I was about to ask that, how is it that, great leaders like Nelson Mandela were side to side with Gandhi, where else Gandhi was literally calling, African people kafirs, degrading us and also calling us savages. So I really want to find out from you, So how does that work? How do we have, you know, such strong leaders siding with a person who literally does not want anything to do with Black people or the empowerment of Black people?
Yeah, you know, when you say literally, like there's a quote that he has where basically he is talking about how the government at that time is dumping down the Kafirs, and I'll quote him, this is 1894, he says, "Why of all places in Johannesburg the Indian location should be chosen for dumping down all Kafirs of the town passes my comprehension. Of course, under my suggestion, the town council must withdraw the Kafirs from the location. About this mixing of the Kafirs with the Indians, I must confess I feel most strongly. I think it is very unfair to the Indian population, and it is an undue tax on even the proverbial patience of my countrymen." So, you know, we said, all right, well, in life, he didn't want to be around the so-called Kafirs, right? So why in death do we have to be around, you know, this, you know, what he also said was that the natives spend their lives in indolence and nakedness, which I felt so ironic because in his older years, he spent his life in indolence and nakedness, sleeping with his nieces and, you know, his relatives. And when you actually, it's so depraved, when you actually read his own like diaries, he says, yeah, my member became stiff again. I'm so embarrassed because, and he's sleeping with his niece. It's too much. It's like the pedophilia is just mind-boggling. And that we didn't even use that as a basis of the Gandhi Man's fault. Like if we went into his sordid life, his, you know, basically responsibility for the death of Kasturba, his wife, where he wouldn't allow her to take, you know, the medicine for malaria, but then later on when he got sick, he took it, right? He said, no, this is foreign. You shouldn't take it. She dies. Then later on, well, I guess I can make an exception. It's like literally just ridiculous. You couldn't make this up even if you wanted to. But what I would say about Nelson Mandela is that he wasn't a researcher by trade or by profession. You know, if you have somebody who's locked up for decades, at what point in time, and then beyond this, it wasn't really until 99 where you had this 100-volume work of, you know, Gandhi, that's searchable PDF. Like, where is Mandela going to get searchable PDFs to read all the things that, you know, Gandhi has written? And, you know, there are several Black people, Martin Luther King, Nana Kwame Nkrumah, there are several who have been duped by him, and it's just because they're not researchers. And this is really showing the role and the responsibility of a researcher is to bring to people the primary sources that they themselves don't even know exists, you know, and then show them how it's relevant to, you know, where we are right now. And when you read, like, once they took the statue down, you read from some students and some of the articles that came out where they were being interviewed, and they said, yeah, you know, this statue was constantly reminding me of how inferior I am. You see, look at how relevant this research is. Here is somebody who's walking around thinking, oh, I'm so inferior, I'm so inferior. And he's being reminded by this, she's being reminded by this every single day, right? So, you know, that's really what it's all about. They had absolutely no idea. If there was a researcher who brought this to their attention, I don't think that they are just complete sellouts. Only a complete sellout would have this information brought to them and say, well, I don't care. You know, he's a symbol. Now let's keep the symbol. I'm a sellout to Black people. You know, and this was actually the context in which I first learned of it. There was a talk given by Nana John Henrik Clarke, a noted historian, back in the early 90s. And this is the first time I've ever even heard about this, where he said, if Nana Martin Luther King knew who Gandhi was, he would have chosen a different, you know, leader to emulate. He would have chosen Sarah Akhenaten, who was known as a Prince of Peace in classical times, right? Who renounced war and has these 4 boundary stela that say he's not going to go beyond this boundary. He's going to spend all of his time inside of Akhetaten, just praising the Aten. So he renounced war, and actually they lost territory because of his stance on peace and things of that nature. But he says, you know, because Gandhi was a faker and a fraud. And I was like, wow, that's very strong words. I think at that time I had seen the Gandhi movie. I was like, oh, wow, why is he saying that? And this set me off to research. And then later on, Okunini Renoko Rashidi, he taught a class through my site, abibitumi.com, dealing with the plight of the Dalits. And this is really what sensitized me to the plight of the Dalits, the Adivasis, the Siddhis, all of these Black people who have been oppressed for hundreds, if not thousands of years by these Indo-Aryan invaders. So that's just a little bit of that. But we can't expect them to know very much about it, because between being in prison and now trying to run a fledgling state, where are you going to get time to sit around and read, hidden documents of Gandhi?
Yeah, but it was also very confusing for me to kind of understand, because I understand that this statue was a donation, right, to the university.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty sure we have leaders in Africa who are we supposed to look up to, and I mean, why can't we have a statue of an African leader in the University of Ghana? For me, it doesn't make sense at all. Why should we accept? Why should we accept a statue all the way from India in the University of Ghana, where else, a black face will definitely empower the very same students who are learning in the university? Because at the end of the day, we're trying to empower black students. We're trying to eradicate poverty. We're trying to literally get rid of colonialism, imperialism. We're trying to get rid of all these systems that are oppressing black people. So why couldn't we have a statue of a black leader in the University of Ghana?
There's a notable quote by Nana Carter G. Woodson where he says, those who lose the, basically the knowledge that comes from history and biography, they lose basically their own sense of self-worth, right? And knowledge of what they could do in the world. There's a quote by, again, Okunini Renoko Rashidi, where he says, what we do for ourselves depends on what we think of ourselves. What we think of ourselves depends on what we know of ourselves. What we know of ourselves depends on what we have been told, right? So very clearly, when we aren't told very much about ourselves, we can't do very much for ourselves, or what we do for ourselves, we can see, evidence through people whose highest goal is to go and serve for some white man somewhere, right? This is our whole idea, and this is why there are more Ghanaian doctors outside of Ghana than are inside of Ghana, right? And there's also a quote from him, this is again Nana Carter G. Woodson, where he says, every man has two educations, that which is given to him and the other, that which he gives himself. Of the two kinds, the latter is by far the more desirable. Indeed, all that is most worthy in man, he must work out and conquer for himself. It is that which constitutes our real and best nourishment. What we are merely taught seldom nourishes the mind like that which we teach ourselves. So, essentially, this has been our situation where we aren't taught about ourselves, and therefore, we think that we're worthless, we, can't do anything. And the highest thing that we can aspire to is to be like Gandhi. And the quote that I mentioned, he says, those who have no record of what their forebears have accomplished lose the inspiration which comes from the teaching of biography and history. And again, that's Nana Carter G. Woodson. He's notable for the book, Miseducation of the Negro, for those who are interested in that, type of information. But yeah, at the University of Ghana, there's not a single full statue. There are a couple busts here. There's like a little mural here, but there's no standing statue of any historical figure that is recognizable or marked or anything. It's like, here's a statue of somebody playing football, and here's a statue of somebody, wearing a graduation cap. And it's just like, the best you can aspire to is to be a nameless, anonymous person, right? Maybe you could be, just a woman holding like a basket or something. So it's like more like generic artwork, peppering the campus than any actual leaders, that we could now look up to. And this is quite intentional, because if you look at the miseducation system, I always say that Ghana doesn't have an education system, right? Unfortunately, it has schooling, but no education. There's a book, actually, an edited volume called Too Much Schooling, Too Little Education. And because of that, I teach Intro to African Studies, and I always try to do what's called a needs assessment. So I ask the students what they know about before we even get started, because if they already know certain stuff and we have a baseline, then we could go to, some deeper stuff. But I'll ask them, and matter of fact, that was the whole crux of the presentation that I did that situated Gandhi Must Fall. I would ask them questions like, all right, have you ever heard of Imahu Imhotep? And I'll ask them, no hands go up. And then, maybe one hand will go, yeah, that was a villain in the Mummy movie. And I'm like, no, that was the world's first multi-genius, right? Yeah. So no hands for that. But then I ask, have you ever heard of Einstein? Every hand goes up. Yeah. I'll ask them, have you ever heard of Imahu Hesi Ra? They'll say, no, I don't know who that is. That's the first recorded doctor in history, or actually a contemporary to Imahu Imhotep. They've never heard of him. When I say, have you ever heard of Hippocrates? Every hand goes up. Yeah, the Hippocratic Oath. All doctors take that. They can run all this down to me. I say, have you ever heard of Imahu Harjadef? They're like, no, what is that? Well, this is the author of the oldest known book. It's a fragmentary text in the history of mankind, and you've never heard of him. And it's because he's black, he's African, he's just like you. That's why you haven't heard of him. But then I'll ask them, have you ever heard of Socrates? All the hands go up, right? And then I'll ask them, have you ever heard of Aset? They'll be like, no, what is that? And I'll say, have you ever heard of Mary, mother of so-called Jesus? Every hand goes up. And I say, Aset is who they plagiarized the story from to get the Mary, right? The Immaculate Conception. Have you ever? And I could go on. Kagimni, they've never heard of. Plato, they've heard of. Imahu Ptahhotep, they've never heard of. Shakespeare, they've heard of. Sarah Wenis, they've never heard of. King James of England, they've heard of. Imahu Pesachet, they've never heard of. Florence Nightingale, they've heard of. Sarah Mary Carré, they've never heard of. Karl Marx, they've heard of. Sarah Sobek Neferu, they've never heard of. This is the first female ruler in the history of the entire world, right? They've never heard of her because guess what? She's black. But Queen Elizabeth, they've all heard of. Imahu Sanhat, they've never heard of. This is one of the most prominent and important pieces of literature from about 4,000 years ago. They've never heard of it. But Homer from Greece, they've all heard of. Nesubiti Hatshepsut, probably the most effective and most powerful female ruler in the history of the entire planet Earth. They've never heard of. But Queen Victoria, they've all heard of. Again, Sarah Akhenaten, they've never heard of, but Gandhi, they've heard of. So what we're really getting at is that how can you actually think that you can do anything if you don't know anything about the precedent of what you've done in the past? And there, the best thing that you can do is try to bleach your skin, perm your hair, and be like, Mary, right? Or be like this imaginary white boy on a stick, right? I'll call him the white kebab, right? That's their imaginary white boy who they pray to every Sunday. So it's like, if that's what you have to aspire to, then this explains so much of our situation. When we say why we're corrupt, well, corruption is the end result of that process, right? That's not the cause of anything. That is the necessary end result of a calculated and intentional process to create anti-Africans who think that they're worthless, who look at their other fellow African and say, oh, you're worthless just like me, right? Because everyone who's done anything of worth looks like these, white folks, real and imaginary, right? So this is really the core of where we're getting at and the reason why we need statues and images of ourselves. And we come from the oldest statue-making culture in the history of the planet Earth. The most famous one from Akkad, what they call the Sphinx, right? Dated back to the last wet period. And I see you want to come in with a question, so I'll pause. Because if you don't stop me, this would be like hours and hours of me just ranting about this situation.
I definitely want to come in with a question, Dr. Obadele. I'm pretty sure, one of our, somewhere, somehow, someone is listening in and they're asking themselves, but how is this relevant to me now? Why are we focusing so much on the past where else we can just move forward? The statue is removed. It's fine. Let's move forward and then have a different discussion. How would you address that person? How would you address that listener? Because, at the end of the day, it's not just, a conversation that is just between me and you, but it's also a conversation about the people who are also listening. And we have people who are listening from different destinations and different way of life, And some people who would actually believe that, politics are destructive, and that, we don't want to talk about Gandhi being racist, We just want to talk about issues of poverty and how do we eradicate poverty. How does this apply to that person? How do we directly engage that person? How do we directly talk to that person?
Yeah. Nana Steve Biko, Ubabu Steve Biko, he says that, the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And someone who would say that is evidence of that, right? Because if they don't know history, they don't understand that the Mohawk conferences of 1890 and 1891, you can read this in a book called Intellectual Warfare by Imahu Jacob Carruthers, where the Mohawk conferences is the reason why we aren't allowed to learn our history, because these were a series of conferences after the Civil War of the United States, where they decided what Negro education is going to be like. They didn't invite any Black people, but they decided that Negro education needs to be like this, this, and this, to make sure that the U.S. doesn't become like Haiti, right, where there's going to be a rebellion and the black people take over. So the best way to do that is to make sure that these black people are miseducated. And, if history didn't matter, then we would see that very clearly because they wouldn't be teaching us all these white history, right? If that person who would ask that, they've heard the name Napoleon, right? But I bet they probably haven't heard of Nana Jean-Jacques Dessalines. And Nana Jean-Jacques Dessalines was the military genius who defeated Napoleon, right? So if history didn't matter, how come you know the loser but you don't know the winner, right? If history didn't matter, and again, it goes to the quotes that I mentioned, those who have no record of what their forebears have accomplished lose the inspiration which comes from the teaching of biography and history. And that's an intentional process, right? So their very mentality is in and of itself an indictment of that question. The very reason why you think it doesn't matter is because you've been miseducated. And ironically, the only thing that will make you understand why it matters and why you know all this white history and you know very little about our own history as African people is because of that miseducational process, right? So, I think that this really gets to the core of it. There's a proverb in Wolof, a major language of Senegal, where it goes like, "Hamsa bopu morgan and waflako," and it translates to self-knowledge is better than being told about oneself, right? And it really gets back to that core point that I'd like for all the listeners to even try to memorize. And it's what you do for yourself depends on what you think of yourself. What you think of yourself depends on what you know of yourself. And what you know of yourself depends on what you have been told. So therefore, you haven't been told very much about yourself, right? So therefore, you don't know very much about yourself. So therefore, you don't think very much of yourself. And therefore, you don't do very much for yourself, right? And for many people, when we talk about freedom, it's something that we really need to revisit, because freedom isn't, I just get to do whatever I want to do. If we're really talking about being independent as Black people, what that entails is more responsibility. This means instead of, our white enslavers feeding us, we feed ourselves. That's what it's really about. Instead of, our white enslavers clothing us, then we clothe ourselves. And this is a situation that we were in before their coming of death and destruction, rape and ravishing, pillage and plunder, that we were actually much more developed before then than we are now, because now in just about every respect, in every walk of life, we're dependent on our enemies. Now, what type of people? And, I look at this in terms of natural selection versus artificial selection. So natural selection is where internally we among ourselves decide who's going to be able to mate, right? Because you've gone through this process of rites of passage and because so forth and so on. We set the socializing process, we set the marriage process, we set all of this. That's natural selection, right? That's letting nature take its course. But what we are is in a situation of artificial selection. In artificial selection, the best example of that is dogs, right? You decide whether your dog is allowed to breed or get spayed or neutered, right? Or whether you put the dog down because that dog is too aggressive, right? And we are basically abdicating, and not because we choose to, but because that's what we've been manufactured to do, abdicating the responsibility of natural selection and allowing white people to determine who gets the job, who gets the grant, right? Who gets, whatever position, who gets this house, who gets the loan, and so forth and so on. That essentially we're allowing them to be human beings and we're allowing ourselves to be dogs, right? Where they decide whether you can do this or do that. And this is a major problem because some of us realize, hold on, we're human beings. And if we actually know this, then it's all about taking the responsibility that any human being would take. And this is why it's very relevant, because until we make that decision, we can't say anything about people putting their knee on our neck, because that's what you can do to a dog, right? I decide whether you live or not. I decide whether you're friendly or not. And it goes from survival of the fittest to survival of the friendliest, as Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson talks about in the Cosmos series. But I think I'll come back to you, because again,
I'm actually enjoying this discussion so much because I'm also learning quite a lot. I'm actually very happy to have you because this discussion is not just about learning, but it also it's deeply about unlearning. Because growing up, this is what we were fed in our own education system, and it's quite funny that we trust our education system, we trust our government to actually give us the correct curriculum and also to give us the correct information in terms of which leaders, or correct propaganda, if there's such a word, in terms of which leaders are we supposed to follow, So, but also, Dr. Obadele, I'm very interested to know, now that the statue has been removed, what is going to happen
Mhm.
after? Are we starting a global movement as we spoke about earlier on, or are we? What are we doing? Are we saying that this also has to be in back? It has to be in the curriculum, that all this information is information that children, the next generation, or even the current generation needs to know about. So, what is the next move after the removal of the statue?
Right, so I actually wanted to share my screen briefly. I don't know if that can be allocated, but there's an article I wrote, and it really gets to the core of this. And this is called Ram Guha is Wrong. Gandhi went from a racist young man to a racist middle-aged man. And it was because Ramchandra Guha is probably the most well-known within India scholar of Gandhi, right? So all of these people in India, so this is where the guy comes from, and everybody's looking at Guha like this is the guru of Gandhi. And he, in an article, he lied and said that by the time Gandhi was in, his middle ages, he, changed and turned over a new leaf, and he was no longer saying the racist things that he was saying, before. And I said, obviously, this is untrue for anyone who's actually read the collected works. And part of the improper Gandhi, as I call it, right? So that's improper propaganda about Gandhi. Gandhi himself was the main progenitor and propagator of it through his autobiography, which was just like chock full of lies. And the only way that you can catch him on the lies is by going back to read the collected works, to read what he was writing at the time. So later on, he tries to, just lie. Oh, I only nurse wounded Zulus. When here we can read his diary about nursing Trooper Forder, right? One of the Britishers who's killing the Zulus, and how he nursed him to health. It's like, you could at least be truthful, right? But that's beyond Gandhi. But basically in the article, I went into how either Guha doesn't know very much about Gandhi, which is a very stark proposition because he's supposed to be the eminent scholar in India on Gandhi. He's either intentionally lying about Gandhi in true Gandhian fashion, or he's unable to do simple arithmetic in terms of what mid-30s is. So I just went into the thing where he says, okay, well, if according to him in his mid-30s he turned over a new leaf, he supposedly had this epiphany in the middle of 1906, but he said some of his most degrading things after his so-called epiphany that he writes about in his autobiography. So on 6 November 1906, he says Indians should not be considered on the same level as Kafirs. He says the Boerman refused to recognize this again in November of that year. The evident and sharp distinctions that undoubtedly exist between British Indians and the Kafir races of South Africa. 1907, this is after his imaginary epiphany. He says if registration is made compulsory, there will be no difference between the Indians and Kafirs. And then December 1907, again after his life-changing epiphany, he says the Indian of the Transvaal is indiscriminately dubbed coolie. One even hears coolie doctors, coolie lawyers. But in that exact same passage, he's lamenting being called a coolie. He then goes on to call the indigenous people Kafirs in that exact same passage. Look at this. He says the Indian is even denied and not only obvious privilege of riding in the same municipal tram cars and government railway carriages as his white fellow colonists. Let me say that again. As his white, he's talking about the Indian, he's not always given the privilege of riding in the same cars as his white fellow colonists, right? He says his children are afforded no facilities for education except they attend the schools set apart for Kafirs, right? Look at this double standard. Now this is when he's 38. This is after his mid-30s, according to Guha, where he turned over a new leaf. So he's 38, unless you don't know what mid-30s is. But we continue, again, 1907. He says the compulsory registration is signifying nothing less than the reduction of British Indians to the status of the Kafir, again, 1907. July 1907, he says, Kafirs are as a rule uncivilized, the convicts even more so. They are troublesome, very dirty, and live almost like animals. The reader can easily imagine the plight of the poor Indian thrown into such company. So these are the Kafirs are as a rule. as though there's been a rule set down that Kafirs are, as a rule, uncivilized. So my sister, Ortalia, I hope you're aware of that rule, because you're sitting there, you're looking quite civilized, but as a rule, you're supposed to be uncivilized according to Gandhi, right? 1908. He said the British rulers take us to be so lowly and ignorant that they assume that, like the Kafirs who can be pleased with toys and pins, we can also be fobbed off with trinkets. So again, this is his view of the intelligence after his epiphany, right? March 1908, he says, many of the native prisoners are only 1 degree removed from the animal and often created rows. The native prisoners, that's you people, right? You Kafirs, are 1 degree removed from an animal. So picture a 360-degree circle, and I just moved my finger 1 degree. Did you see it? Then what is he really telling us, right? 1908, he said that we were marched off to a prison intended for Kafirs. There, our garments were stamped with the letter N, which meant we were being classed with the natives. We were all prepared for hardships, but not quite for this experience. We could understand not being classed with the whites, but to be placed on the same level with the natives seemed too much to put up with. He says there's nothing for it but to let ourselves be classed with the Kafirs and starve. And he says, this is 1909. So he's in prison because he started his agitation. So you think, oh, when he's starting his agitation, this means that he's down with the people. He's turned over a new leaf. But he's in prison lamenting, right? He says, I observed with some regret that some Indians were happy to sleep in the same room as the Kafirs. We may entertain no aversion to Kafirs, but we cannot ignore that there is no common ground between them and us. So you think that Kafirs is our actual name, like we were called by our mama. You're Kafir and you're Kafiret. Well, this is our native name. Thank you so much. And he says, I resolved in my mind on an agitation to ensure that Indian prisoners are not lodged with Kafirs or others, right? Now, this is, a lot of people don't actually even understand what racism is. They think racism means saying mean things, right? And it's really not that. It's about the systematic structures, right? Infrastructure and processes that are designed to facilitate the exploitation of one race by another, right? So this is systemic, and this is really what Gandhi advocated for in terms of his actions, right? So before he went to prison, he was single-handedly, according to him, responsible for making sure that the Durban Post and Telegraph offices had separate doors so that the Indians don't have to go through the same door as the natives, as the Kafirs, right? Now, this is talking about setting up a structure, right? Not just I'm saying mean things about you, I'm setting up the structure that would later on be known as apartheid, right? So he set up, and basically when you think about apartheid, from the whites to the coloreds to the blacks and so forth and so on, that this is basically that multi-tier system, the caste system as it existed in India, having been transplanted in no small part due to Gandhi's efforts into South Africa. So apartheid wouldn't even have ended up the way it ended up if not for this caste-like system that Gandhi introduced with the segregation of the Durban Post and Telegraph offices. Before it's just colonizers and colonized, that's what the whites were doing, what he's lamenting. What he introduced is this multi-tiered caste system into South Africa that later on came to be known as apartheid.
Dr. Obadele,
so 1909.
I have to cut you. I have to cut you because time is not on our side. Time is not on our side. No but problem. I'm really excited about this conversation. I wish we can actually talk about it the whole day, because I think it's quite a very interesting and
I actually can if you let me.
a very informative discussion.
But I'll share that article with you, and maybe you can share it with your listeners later.
Yes, I'll definitely. Yes, I'll definitely do that. Dr. Obadele, just in closing, just tell us, where can we find you? Because I tried to look, I tried to look you up on social media. I tried to look you up on, on Twitter. I could not find you. Where do we find you? How do we get a hold of your work? How do we get a hold of your, some of the documents that you, especially the document that you just sent me? How do we get a hold of your work? How do we get a hold of you? And how do we get in touch with you as well?
Yeah, very good. Part of the process for re-establishing Ma'at, and Ma'at is the first legal system in the history of the world, ethical and moral system, and it was established by our African ancestors, and everything that we strove for was to restore Ma'at. And part of restoring Kemet, that's the indigenous name for what they now call ancient Egypt. This is the land of Black people. Part of that restoration process is taking responsibility and not depending on our white neo-colonial enemies to allow us to communicate. So I quit all white social media. A lot of it I was never on, like I never had an Instagram or any of these things. And what I did is I created my own social education network called Abibitumi, and that's spelled Abibitumi.
Okay.
Thousands and thousands
Can
of
you
exclusively
please
black
just
people.
spell it again?
Yeah.
Okay.
Abitumi.com, abibitumi.com, and that translates to Black Power in the language, Abibitumi, Black Power in the Tree language. So if you want to see me, you know, this is the thing that I think is a huge contradiction. So we're on white platforms talking about how we need to do for ourselves, right? Are we insane? Yes, we are, right? We've been manufactured to be. So we're on Twitter saying, yeah, we black people, we need to do something for ourselves. We're on Facebook, yeah, let's do something for ourselves. We're on YouTube and all these places. And, you know, it's really not good. So I systematically disconnected, like Facebook, I quit back in, I think, 2012. The last ones to go were WhatsApp and, you know, YouTube. And, you know, I have quite a few videos on there, and I left them on there, but I decided to stop posting, and then also found abibitumi.tv and abibitumitv.com. In terms of my publications, my first name, last name.com, obadelekamban.com, there's a menu link where you can read this, you know, the article, the book chapter that we wrote in collaboration with Rose Must Fall, and so forth and so on. So if you want to see me, who's about Black liberation, you have to stop defrauding yourself and everyone else that you're actually for Black people, and get off these white social media networks, get off of them, abandon them, leave the digital plantation to join our maroon community, abibitumi.com. If there's anyone who's supposed to be sympathetic to the Black cause and they're still on any of these white social media platforms, you gotta pull their coat, right? You gotta pull their card and say, hold on, you must not really be about it. You just wanna get likes for saying, let's do for self, and then you get 1,000 likes. Oh yeah, we should have our own, then you get 1,000. This is a scam. This is a fraud that you're perpetrating against the masses of people. So I'll end on that, abibitumi.com, abibitumitv.com. And I'm not saying that to put anyone down. I recognize that in myself, that I'm defrauding people if I'm saying let's do for self and I'm on these white platforms. So rather than just beating people upside the head with it, which I don't mind doing, I had better give them a place to come to, which I've already done, and that's abibitumi.com. Thousands and thousands of Black people from throughout the world, exclusively African equals Black platform. And in that, it becomes a safe space where we don't have to worry about going into Facebook jail. We don't have to worry about copyright strikes and, you know, our accounts getting shut down because we said something that's actually beneficial for African people, and the whites who own that platform don't want anything that's beneficial for Black people. That's what we're about. Abibi Fahondie.
Thank
and
you.
I think
Thank you
that's
so
my
much, Dr. Obadele. Wow. I'm actually overwhelmed. And this was actually such a great discussion. I'm really honored to have you on the show. To our listeners, do please check this conversation out, particularly for people who have actually missed the show. Unfortunately, you have to check it out on Facebook. I know that we just spoke about Facebook, Dr. Obadele, but hey.
Of course. This is the manufacturing process. We haven't stopped the manufacturing process yet. So the assembly line is still going.
There's a lot to learn. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to build Africa. So thank you so much for joining us on the show. Thank you so much for everyone who actually had a chance to tune in. Let's chat on Facebook. Let's chat on Twitter at King Africa Online Radio TV, #Speak Your Mind. Thank you so much.
And let's chat on Abibitumi, and I'm gonna hold you to it, my sister. If I don't see you on Abibitumi, I'm not coming back on King Africa Online Radio. So let's chat on Abibitumi. That's my challenge to you, my sister.
No. You have to come back. I'm actually planning to have you for another discussion.
So that means you will be on Abibitumi, and I would love to see you there once you do so.
Thank you so much, Dr. Obadele. Thank you.
All right, thank you too.
Okay, so we have stopped recording and we have also stopped streaming. So I'm going to send you the video of this interview most probably in 2 days' time. I hope that will be okay. And hopefully I'm going to have you again on the show. Talk about...
hopefully I'll see you on Abibitumi first. So
definitely. You're definitely going to see
You'll
me.
get to set up.
You're
Good.
definitely going to see me. Thank you so much.
It's not scary for Black people to do for ourselves.
There
Nothing
you
will
go.
happen to you. You'll be
No,
fine.
that's true. That's true. I mean, I don't want to be censored on Facebook, so I would rather be on a platform that that is allowing for us to be Black and to be
Absolutely.
proudly Black without hiding or without yeah, running around like crazy people. So thank you so much
That's right.
for making your time to come on the show. Hopefully we'll have you again on a different subject. You're a true inspiration.
Good.
Thank you. Bye
All right. Beautiful.
bye.